second half of the section dealing with the sectional issues and leading up to secession in 1861, and then straight into the Civil War. So I'll see how far I get with these additional items, and I may move, into the Civil War. But this is on the Civil War file, and I'm starting with slide 12. We talked about some of those events leading year by year where tensions become increasingly polarized in the country. There is a slide in there, too, of a guy beating another guy with a cane. These were two congressmen in the House of Representatives, a northern and a southern one. And the southerner got up one day discussing slavery and took a cane and beat the northern guy almost to death, which, of course, did not help tensions at all in the country. But you have the Free Soil Party, Free Soil, Free Men, that forms immediately during the Mexican War. You have the 1850 Compromise, where now Northerners are obligated to help slave catchers catch runaway slaves. You have Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a crucial event. You have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and I'm starting with slide number 12, with the 1856 election and the Austin Manifesto. Austin Manifesto was not an act, not a law, but it was a overture, basically. American ministers to Britain, France, and Spain drew up an agreement between them that if Spain would not sell Cuba to the United States should just, and I'm quoting here, wrest it, W-R-E-S-T, take it from her. Why did we want Cuba? Number one, it's wall-to-wall sugar plantations. This is a place for the South to expand. Southerners were all for it. And the other problem, of course, is they don't want a slave revolt and a slave takeover like had happened in Haiti. The North response to this, of course, when it got out, this was supposed to be secret arrangements, but when it got out, is Northerners were absolutely furious that the United States was going to end up with a Caribbean slave empire. So the Austin Agreement or announcement, which was supposed to be very quiet, did not turn out that way, but it only antagonizes things north and south. And oddly enough, 1898, we did exactly that. We went in and invaded Cuba, but it was much, much later. The 56 election, you can see on the map, and again, if you go back and look at these electoral maps, it's quite interesting because the national parties are completely split down the middle. The Democrats nominate Buchanan, who is probably not the right guy to have as a presidency. You have huge national problems in the country, and you have a very mediocre president. Millard Fillmore, from a new party called the American Party, which didn't last too long. The one to look at is the new Republican Party. It is less than a year old, and in less than a year, that Republican Party, which is the successor to the Free Soil Party, Free Soil changed their name to Republicans, sweeps 11 of 16 northern states. They nominated John C. Fremont, who was a hero in the California problems, and I'm sure he was picked for his name because what could be better? Free soil, free men, Fremont, and he becomes the Republican candidate. At this point, there is nothing holding the country together. The churches have split into North and South. Now any national political party has dissolved and they have become sectional parties with, as they said, and I'm quoting, irreconcilable differences. Dred Scott, slide 14, is a name that every American should know. We should all know Uncle Tom. We should all know John Brown. We should all know Dred Scott. Dred Scott is a Supreme Court case that went up before the Supreme Court in 1857, the year after the 56 election. It is based on actions that happened in 1836, 20 years earlier. Dred Scott was owned by a Kentucky doctor The doctor was sent into Indian Territory in Wisconsin and Minnesota when they were territories, not states, to fight some of the Native Americans there. When he went there with the U.S. Army, he took his personal servant, Dred Scott. 10 years later, 46, somehow a sympathetic lawyer got hold of Dred Scott's case, and it is filed in a local court. Dred Scott said that I should be free based on what? Based on the fact that he had been taken into free territory. And based on that, I should no longer be a slave. The suit was filed to plead for Dred Scott and his wife, for two people. So it goes through the courts for 10 years. Finally, in 57, it reaches the Supreme Court. So this is 20 years after the actual event took place. And the issue is a huge one. Can a slave brought to free territory become free? Because that would also reflect on, can a slave who makes it into a free state be free as well? The decision of the Supreme Court, which just shows you the Supreme Court is not always right, it's a classic decision, was 6-9. If I tell you that 6 of the 9 justices were Southern and pro-slavery, that tells you what their decision was. They didn't rule on slavery. They punted. They avoided the issue of slavery. What they ruled on was the status of slaves, and this is pretty outrageous and pretty interesting to us today. The Supreme Court said, pretty strong decision, 6-3, that African Americans were not human beings, they were property. And as property, the Constitution protects the right to property. And I'm quoting from their decision. African Americans were, quote, beings of an inferior order with no rights any white man was bound to respect. Thank you very much, Supreme Court. No African, slave or free, North or South, according to the Supreme Court, could ever become a citizen. I'm quoting again, no state can make him a member of this nation by making him a member of that state. So what this does is more chaos, more fuel to the fire. This is 4 years before the Civil War. The Northwest Ordinance that freed no slavery north of the Ohio River, the 1820 Compromise, the 1850 Compromise are all invalid. If slavery is protected by the Constitution everywhere, all of these agreements are null and void. It nullifies them. What happened, of course, in many northern states, they changed their citizenship rules. Some of them immediately protected the rights of free African Americans to vote. Some of them took it back because now African Americans could never become citizens. The other effect it had was it absolutely radicalized the new Republican Party. And it pushed neutral Northerners, who really weren't that concerned about the slavery issue, which was the vast majority, into the Republican Party. Many people were outraged and said this is ridiculous and became Republicans. What happened to Dred Scott and his wife? They were bought, embarrassingly enough, not by an American. The original owner had died, so his son or grandson owned them now. They were old people. They weren't even good workers anymore. They were too old. And a British citizen bought both of them, freed them, and took them to Britain. Dred Scott, unfortunately, died a year later. So he spent 20 years fighting for his freedom, but he died free. He died a year after he was bought and freed. Okay, the next thing, if you look at slides 15 through 18, we are talking about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And slide 17 is a good photograph of an actual hat that Abraham Lincoln owned. I don't spend too much time on Lincoln because we all know something about Lincoln. Was he a freak? Was he had genetic defects? He was 6'4". That's pretty tall for the time, but it's not completely out of line. George Washington was 6'3". Jefferson was 6'2". Andrew Jackson was close to 6'2". It was unusual, but it was not defective. at the time. On the other hand, Abraham Lincoln always wore that crazy tall hat. So when you see him in a crowd, in the photographs we have of Lincoln in a crowd, you can pick him out from half a mile away. He's like 7 feet tall with that hat. Those tall hats were like 8 inches tall. I just think it's kind of interesting. Okay. So LincolnDouglas debates. What is going on here? This is the next year after Dred Scott, 1858. Again, year by year by year, the situation never gets to die down. Lincoln and Douglas are both running for the Senate seat in Illinois. And they go around the state of Illinois and something like 11 of the major towns, and they gave open debates. This is very different than what we do today. It was very symbolic that Barack Obama got his start as a senator from Illinois because he literally was taking the seat of Lincoln. He was running for the same seat that Lincoln ran for. So they go out. Debates at the time, there was no media, there were no loudspeakers. You got up on a wagon or a platform or the courthouse steps and you talked as loud as you could, and thousands, oftentimes thousands of people showed up because this is literally the only show in town. So it's great entertainment. Number two, a lot of people in the North by this time are very, very interested in the issue of slavery. A lot of them are now Republicans. So Douglas, a very good politician, self-made man, self-educated lawyer, very enamored with politics, very skilled politician. He is debating Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had, again, self-educated again, had a law, not a law degree, but a legal training, and had run and been elected to the Illinois legislature as a local representative in 1936, but then he lost for U.S. Congress representative in 1840. This is interesting, by 36 votes out of 500. If he had won that election, would it have been a different history? Lincoln, both Lincoln and Douglas, great voices, great memory, great politicians. So they debate. And the issue they are debating is what to do about slavery in the territories, which is the huge issue of the time. I'm going to read just short quotes. This is their very clear positions on the issue. Both of them sound incredibly logical. So you can see voters had a really difficult choice here. It was not easy in the 1850s to say one way or the other. This is Douglas, and his position was popular sovereignty. No expansion of let the people decide what to do in the new territories. We ought to extend to the Negro race all the rights, all the privileges, all the immunities which they can exercise with the safety of society. Humanity requires we should give them all of these privileges. Christianity commands that we should extend those privileges to them. The question then arises, what are those privileges and what is the nature and extent of them? My answer is, that is a question which each state must answer for itself. If the people of all the states will act on that great principle and each state mind its own business, attend to its own affairs, take care of its own Negroes, and not meddle with its neighbors, then there will be peace between North and South, East and West throughout the whole Union. So in other words, his position is each state should decide popular sovereignty. Of course, the southern states had already decided that a long time ago, but he's also arguing this for the new territories. Lincoln's position is no expansion of slavery, not eliminate slavery. Did Lincoln free the slaves? This is a yes and no thing. Yes, he did kind of later on, but definitely not when he becomes president. That was not in his mind. Again, I'm quoting from Lincoln. Okay? We have the real question in this controversy that is on everybody's mind is the statement on the part of one class that looks upon the institution of slavery and of another class that does not look upon it as a wrong. They look upon it as being a moral, social, and political wrong, the North, and while they contemplate it as such, they nevertheless have due regard for the difficulties of getting rid of it in any satisfactory way. And to all the constitutional obligations thrown about it. Yet they insist that it should, as far as may be treated as a wrong, and one of the methods of treating it as a wrong is to make a provision that it shall grow no larger. So Lincoln says slavery is, if it is a wrong, if it is a moral wrong, then the best thing to do about it, not to interfere where it already exists, because that is protected by the Constitution, but to not let it expand. Douglas's argument is let the people in each new territory decide. Who won the Senate seat? Guess what? Stephen Douglas won the Senate seat. So what did the people of Illinois believe? They believed that the people in each territory should decide the two things, decide the issue of slavery. Lincoln lost. This is a good thing for the country because he was open. He was not in Congress, which wasn't a great thing, but he was available to run for president in 1860. If he had been in Congress, maybe he wouldn't have run. We don't know, because he would have been a very new congressman. Okay, slide 20 is 20, and the slides after that to 20 to 24 is John Brown. We've already seen John Brown previously in the Kansas problems. In Bloody Kansas, he shows up with a whole bunch of his sons, and they slaughter slave owners in their bed to free the slaves. Harpers Ferry, John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry is October of 1859. Okay, I don't care about the dates, but this is getting closer and closer to the Civil War. Who is John Brown? If you look at slide 22, in my opinion, this is a guy with crazy eyes. Is he crazy? That's still a debate that's going on. He did have insanity on both sides of his family. He had grandparents on both sides that were insane. The argument has been that this guy is crazy. Maybe not. John Brown did come from upstate New York, a very poor region. It still is today, a very poor region. He had 2 wives and 21 children. So he has children at home from infants in diapers all the way into their early 20s. During his lifetime, people went back and checked, and he had about 24 jobs, 24 occupations, and he failed at every single one. The 1837 panic that Andrew Jackson triggered ruined him financially. So when abolition comes along, when the idea of freeing slaves come along, John Brown talks to God. God talks back to John Brown and said, "You are going to be my strong right hand to end slavery." And John Brown, after failing at everything he did, found an occupation he was really good at. Finally, he is totally devoted to the abolitionist cause. Personally, he was one of the few who was totally unprejudiced. He would eat, sleep, and work with African Americans with no problem. Even most abolitionists did not do that. He is also utterly, totally ruthless. And he said at one point, hang on. Okay, sorry. My husband's phone on the desk. And he said at one point, "I will kill any man who stands between me and the right as coolly as I would eat my breakfast," which is what he did. So how crazy is this guy? On the other hand, some of his admirers and abolitionists said he is the most courageous man I ever saw. So you have to make the decision for yourself. The raid on Harpers Ferry, the map, you can see why Harpers Ferry is in a very strategic location where 2 rivers come together in Western Virginia. I've actually been to Harpers Ferry. It's really, really an interesting place with a very good museum there. And what they were after at Harpers Ferry was not the location, but there was a U.S. armory there. There was a weapons stockpile. More important, there was a gun factory. So there was a gun factory making thousands of rifles for the U.S. Army at Harpers Ferry. John Brown, funded by abolitionists, gets 3 of his sons, 3 of his adult sons, 13 other white people, 5 free African Americans. He asked Frederick Douglass to join him. Frederick Douglass said, "You're nuts. I'm not doing that. You can't attack a U.S. armory." He asked Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman said, "I will be there," but she got sick at the last moment and did not show up. Several of the free blacks joined him because they had spouses they were trying to get out of slavery. They had relatives they were concerned about. So this group, in the middle of the night one night, attacks the Federal Army, the gun-making factory. Ironically enough, the first person killed was a slave, an African-American slave whose job it was to guard the gun factory as the night watchman. And they had to kill him so he didn't raise the alarm. So ironically, here is a raid to help slaves, and the first person killed is a slave. Okay, the assumption was we will seize this stuff and we will arm the slaves and start a slave revolt. When the word got out about it, no slaves came to join John Brown. What did get sent out were federal troops from Washington, D.C., which is maybe a day's ride on a horse from Harpers Ferry. And the commander sent to subdue John Brown and his men was a very experienced American colonel in the U.S. Army named Robert E. Lee. So that building that you see there, that brick building, in slide 23, I always thought that this was the armory. No, the armory is a big, much larger factory building, basically. It has been burned to the ground and destroyed since then. This was the firehouse. When you have gunpowder and guns around, you want a firehouse. This was the firehouse, and this is the building that John Brown and his men holed up in because they figured they could hold off people for a long time, which they did for several days. Finally, Lee gets John Brown surrounded. A number of people are killed. 8 were killed, including 2 of the 3 sons that went with him. John Brown is captured alive. He is immediately tried, and within 6 weeks, he is hung. And you see in that slide 24, the very famous painting of John Brown going to the gallows to be hung. And if you recognize the arrangement of that painting, it is the same arrangement used in hundreds of paintings and illustrations of Christ going to the cross and blessing the baby on the way. So again, John Brown is seen in the North as a Christ-like figure. As he walks to the gallows, he has a piece of paper in his hand, and he hands it to a slave along the way, and on the paper was written, "The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." And he was absolutely right. So John Brown is hung, and as he is hung, he is smiling. He is happy. Because why is this guy smiling when he's hung? Because he has now become a martyr for the abolitionist cause, and he knows it. So is he crazy or not? If he succeeded in starting a slave uprising, he succeeded. If he didn't, he becomes a martyr. So questionable how crazy this guy was, but I don't know, his eyes look very strange to me. In the North, John Brown immediately becomes a martyr. Huge support for abolition. The marching song of the Union Army, which is a good tune to march to, is called John Brown's Body. And part of the lyrics go, John Brown's body is moldering in the grave, but his truth goes marching on, that in his cause, in his name, we will fight. In the South, the reaction is a lot more paranoia and fear. Not only is there the fear of slaves rising up and slaughtering us in our beds, which happened in Nat Turner's rebellion, but now the North, according to Southerners, is going to actually help and arm the slaves to do so. So the reaction in the South is they start organizing militia, they start gathering weapons, and you can see there's conflict on the horizon. Southern newspaper, great quote about it. Now that the radical Republicans have the power, I suppose they will John Brown us all. John Brown becomes a verb. The John Browning us all, what does that mean? That the North is going to help the slaves revolt. So Harpers Ferry, the 1860 election comes along. Less than a year later, and the country is in total chaos. President Buchanan is a mediocre talent at best. The best minds in the country are not in Congress, by and large. Abraham Lincoln is not there, for one thing. It is a national power struggle over slavery. The industrial North, which is convinced that the South is going to not only protect but expand slavery every chance it gets, and the agricultural South, which is convinced that the North wants to destroy the South and slavery. Look at the number of states there, which we will get to, but in the 1860 election, if you look at the map, you can see there's no middle ground. It is completely North and South. There is a Union Party, which was basically a peace party against war at any cost. Just make peace. I don't care how it is. And you will see they were strong in the border states for obvious reasons. The Republicans nominate Lincoln. Lincoln was a moderate Republican. He is not saying end slavery. That's a myth. What Lincoln was campaigning on is no expansion of slavery in the new territories. We will not have new slave states. In the convention, the presidential convention, the Democratic convention, they are completely split. The Southern Democrats walked out. They nominate their own candidate, Breckinridge, and the Northern Democrats nominated Douglas. And Douglas's position was popular sovereignty. So the last national organization holding the country together politically has now split in two. Again, Abraham Lincoln, you think slavery is a right and ought to be extended, while we think it is a wrong and ought to be restricted. That is the rub. So what is Lincoln's opinion on slavery? It's mixed. Is he a racist? We would call him that today. At the time, he seemed very liberal. This is a great quote from Lincoln in 1854, before he's campaigning for anything. Let it not be said, I am contending for political and social equality between blacks and whites. I am arguing against the extension of a bad thing, slavery, which where it is already existing, we must of necessity manage as best as we can. Should we make free blacks politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit to this. And if my feelings would, we know well that those of the great mass of white people will not. So Lincoln says very clearly before the war, I do not feel that free African Americans are our political and social equals. That is not what I am arguing for. I am arguing for no extension of slavery. Look again at that 1860 map. Lincoln got only 40% of the popular vote. He is a minority president, but he won in the Electoral College. He got more electoral votes than all three of the others. Okay? Notice also Lincoln got zero support in the South. 6 weeks after his election, the South secedes. The Southern states begin to secede. In terms of popular votes, Stephen Douglas got almost as many votes as Lincoln. What would have happened if Douglas had been elected? It's one of those ifs in history we don't know. But the minute Lincoln is elected, the states begin to secede and war is on the horizon. So we will start with the Civil War next time. Stay safe and stay well.